You know exactly what a virtuoso musician looks like. Like you could picture right now.
Oh, yeah. You picture the sweat forming on the brow, the deep calluses on the fingertips.
Exactly. You picture the physical exertion. I mean, when someone sits down at a grand piano, the mechanics are undeniable.
It's literal carpentry at that point.
Right, it is. You strike a heavy ivory key, a complex system of levers activates, and a small wooden hammer physically strikes a tightened steel string. The air vibrates, and the maestro points to the piano and says, you know, there, that is where the music comes from.
It's a very comforting image, mostly because it provides this immediate, visible chain of physical causality. Action, mechanical reaction, sound.
Yeah, we trust things we can see. We
Right.
trust the physical instrument. But what happens when you take that grand piano away?
Right, when things get a little less obvious.
Exactly. What happens when you step into the world of digital sequencing or sample-based production,
Mhm.
and the maestro isn't striking a key, they are just pressing a flat, gray plastic square on an electronic box.
The physical causality completely vanishes.
It really does. To the traditional eye, the creation of the art suddenly looks mechanically murky. It just looks like someone pushing a button.
Which is exactly why that gray plastic pad has generated decades of, honestly, pretty vicious debate.
And that is exactly what we are dismantling today in this deep dive, using the massive stack of sources you brought in. We are looking at a highly controversial question.
Right, the big one.
What makes music real? Like if a musician isn't blowing into a brass horn or strumming a wooden guitar, is it still a legitimate art form?
It's a fascinating question,
Yeah.
and we have an incredible variety of material to unpack this today.
Oh, yeah. We've got academic papers on the racial framing of traditional music theory, historical corporate documents like the infamous 1970s Harvard report.
I can't wait to get into that one.
Same. Plus, we have highly technical engineering manuals for vintage drum machines, Reddit threads, and a deeply analytical interview with rapper and MIT professor Lupe Fiasco.
It is a phenomenal collection of material for you to dive into today. And to answer that question of what makes music legitimate, we can't just look at the technology in a vacuum.
No, definitely not.
Right. We need to examine the lens through which we are all trained to judge music in the first place, the institutional biases of traditional music theory.
That's the starting line.
Exactly. From there, we have to look at the brutal economic conditions of the 1970s that actually forced artists to abandon those traditional instruments.
Because they didn't really have a choice.
They didn't. And only then can we truly understand the technological virtuosity it took to turn a gray plastic pad into a legitimate musical continuum.
Well, let's start with that institutional lens, because looking through these academic papers, there's a concept that completely reframed how I think about music education.
You're talking about Philip Ewell's work.
Yes, it's an academic paper and a subsequent book review by music theorist Philip Ewell titled Music Theory and the White Racial Frame. Ewell is making a massive claim here.
He really is. He is arguing that American music theory, as it is taught in conservatories and universities today, is entirely dominated by a white male frame.
It is a bold claim, but, he backs it up by looking at the literal foundations of the curriculum.
Right. He points out that the traditional academy implicitly and sometimes explicitly holds up the music of 18th and 19th century white German-speaking men.
So Beethoven, Bach, Mozart.
Exactly. And the theorists who studied them, like Heinrich Schenker, the Academy holds them up as the absolute, unquestionable pinnacle of musical thought.
Okay, I want to play devil's advocate here, though, because
Yeah.
I think a lot of people listening might have the same initial reaction I did.
Which is,
Beethoven and Bach were objective masters, like their compositions are incredibly complex. So what is the problem with using them as the foundational standard for music theory?
well, the problem isn't their mastery. Their mastery is undeniable. The problem is what Ewell, borrowing from sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva, calls colorblind racism within the Academy.
How does that work in music theory, though?
Basically, music theory presents itself as a pure objective science. It claims to be a perfect meritocracy based entirely on the mathematical relationships of notes on a page.
Right, just looking at the raw data.
Right. But by setting 18th century European functional tonality, which are the specific rules of harmony and melody developed in that one specific region at that one specific time, as the default standard for all music, the Academy creates a rigged game.
Okay, I'm looking at this phrase in the notes from philosopher Robin James, who Ewell cites. She calls this the epistemology of ignorance.
Yes, that's a key concept here.
I know what epistemology means, like the study of knowledge, but how does that apply to a rigged game in a music classroom?
Let's break it down. Epistemology of ignorance is a systemic practice where the intuition, preferences, and cultural norms of the most privileged group in a society are normalized and taught as objective, universal knowledge.
Okay,
So
so
if an institution decides that the primary measure of good music is complex harmonic modulation, which is a hallmark of German classical music, they can just ignore other parameters.
they can ignore, say, rhythmic complexity.
Exactly, which is the foundation of West African music. They can ignore microtonal pitch bending, which is central to Indian classical music.
That makes total sense. They intentionally separate the musical analysis from its cultural context.
Right, they claim they are just looking at the notes impartially and then use that impartial system to systematically disadvantage any music built on different cultural foundations.
It's the old analogy, right? Like, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid.
Precisely. It is a structural framework used to dismiss entirely different traditions while maintaining a veneer of academic objectivity.
And the sources highlight exactly how this academic framework bleeds into mainstream media and is used to dismiss rap specifically.
Yes, the Ben Shapiro example.
Right. There's a quote in our sources from conservative pundit Ben Shapiro. And just to be clear to you listening, we aren't taking a political side here.
No, not at all.
We are just looking at this impartially as an absolute textbook example of Yule's theory operating in the wild.
Yes, the quote is quite revealing regarding definitions.
So Shapiro claims rap is not music.
Mm-hmm.
And his reasoning is that, by his definition, music requires three elements: rhythm, melody, and harmony.
Right.
He argues rap only fulfills the rhythm component, completely lacking traditional melody and harmony, and therefore it is just rhythmic speaking.
That's his argument.
Now, again, playing devil's advocate here, if a piece of audio literally lacks a sung melody and a complex chord progression, isn't it fair by textbook definition to categorize it as something other than music?
Well, it would be if the textbook were a universal law of nature. But Ewell's entire point is that the textbook itself is the frame.
Because who wrote the textbook?
Exactly. European theorists wrote that definition of music. Shapiro is using the specific criteria of one musical tradition to invalidate a completely different musical tradition.
A tradition that prioritizes completely different elements.
Right, things like rhythmic syncopation, timbral texture, and lyrical density. It's like saying a masterfully crafted Japanese sushi roll isn't real food because it wasn't baked in an oven.
Well, that's a great way to put it. The metric itself is culturally specific, not universal.
Exactly.
And it's wild because this isn't some new phenomenon isolated to hip-hop. The sources show us this is a historical, generational cycle.
It really is. It stems from a psychological concept known as repetition compulsion.
Meaning what, exactly?
It means we see older generations inevitably, almost reflexively, attack the new forms of expression. If we look back a century, jazz was the target.
Right. The notes mention critics in the early 1900s dismissing jazz as barbaric and devil's music.
And look at the specific language they used. Early critics claimed jazz was devoid of harmonic merit. They hated the improvisation because it didn't follow the rigid, pre-written compositional rules of classical music.
So because they couldn't validate it through their European lens, they just declared it a threat to musical integrity.
Yes. And then rock and roll faced the exact same vitriol in the 1950s. Punk rock faced it in the 70s.
Which connects directly to that Reddit thread included in our sources,
Yeah.
titled Death of the Guitar.
That thread is a perfect modern example.
It really is. The original poster is so frustrated because major music media outlets are constantly running articles claiming the guitar is dead or rock is dead.
Just because the Billboard charts aren't dominated by 1980s style guitar solos anymore?
Exactly. But the commenters in that thread are incredibly astute. One points out that this anxiety is entirely cyclical.
They remember the exact same panic when rap first hit the mainstream, or when the synthesizer revolutionized pop in the 80s, or when grunge killed the flamboyant guitar hero in the 90s.
It's like the older generation always conflates the decline of their specific preferred instrument with the death of musical talent altogether.
Exactly. The mindset is basically, if it doesn't look like the physical carpentry of the art I grew up validating, it must not be art.
But, I want to make sure we don't just treat this as an abstract academic debate happening in ivory towers or on internet forums.
Because it has real-world impact.
Oh, absolutely. This framing, this idea that black music or new music isn't real, has visceral, destructive consequences. We have to talk about Disco Demolition Night.
July 12th, 1979. It is one of the darkest, most stark examples of this cultural panic manifesting as actual physical violence.
Paint the picture for us because the details in the sources are just shocking. This happened at Comiskey Park in Chicago, right?
Yes, at a baseball game. A local Chicago rock radio DJ named Steve Dahl had recently been fired because his station flipped to a disco format.
And he was not happy about it.
He was furious. So he organized a promotional event with the Chicago White Sox during a doubleheader. The promotion was simple. Fans could get into the stadium for just 98 cents if they brought a disco record.
To do what with him?
The plan was to collect all these records in a giant wooden crate in center field and literally blow them up with explosives between the games.
And 50,000 people showed up, mostly young white men. But the detail that really stands out in the sources comes from Vince Lawrence.
Right, he was a black teenager working as a stadium usher that night.
Yeah, and he noticed something chilling about the records people were bringing to the gates. What was it?
Lawrence noted that they weren't just bringing disco records. They were bringing Marvin Gaye records, Stevie Wonder, Tyrone Davis, funk records, R&B records.
Basically anything made by a black artist.
Exactly. Regardless of the genre, it was being tossed into this collection bin to be destroyed.
So under the guise of defending real rock and roll, it just became an excuse to violently reject black culture.
The cultural historians in our sources explicitly note the underlying racism and homophobia of the event, because disco was born in black, Latino, and gay underground clubs.
Right.
And this mob, fueled by cheap beer and a hatred for this new culture, literally rioted. When Dahl detonated the records, it blew a massive crater in the outfield grass.
That is insane.
The fans rushed the field, they tore up the bases, lit fires, and clashed with riot police in full tactical gear. The White Sox had to actually forfeit the second game.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
But honestly, the scariest part isn't even the riot itself. It's the boardroom reaction the morning after.
The industry fallout was instantaneous and just devastating.
What happened?
The major music industry executives looked at the footage of 50,000 rioting rock fans and they panicked. They were terrified of the backlash.
So they caved to the mob.
Completely. Almost overnight, they drastically defunded black music genres. Record labels entirely dissolved their disco and dance departments.
Wow.
Radio stations flipped their formats back to rock and pop, completely freezing out black artists who had literally been dominating the charts weeks prior.
It was a structural erasure of an entire musical movement, fueled entirely by cultural panic.
Exactly.
So if we take all of this, Philip Ewell's academic white male frame, the conservative pundits like Shapiro dismissing the genre, the literal riots destroying the records, and the industry defunding the departments.
It's a lot of institutional weight against them.
It is. And I keep coming back to a central question. If the traditional academy, like the National Association of Schools of Music, still demands skills like keyboard harmony and reading Western notation.
Which the sources say they absolutely do.
Right. Then how does a kid in the inner city who is structurally locked out of that world ever break through?
Well, the short answer is they don't break through the traditional door. They are forced to build an entirely new house.
Because they have no other choice.
Right. Because the structural exclusion hip-hop faced in the academy mirrored an even harsher, more brutal economic exclusion in their actual neighborhoods.
And this brings us to the second massive topic in your sources, the economic realities.
Yes, we have to look at the economic forces of the 1970s to understand why hip-hop built a completely new foundation based on technology rather than traditional instruments.
And this whole section revolves around a document I had literally never heard of before, but it absolutely blew my mind. The Harvard Report.
It is a foundational piece of music industry history, yet it's rarely ever discussed.
What exactly was it?
In 1972, Columbia Records, which was a division of the massive CBS Corporation, commissioned a highly calculated market analysis. And they didn't just hire any consultants, they went to the graduate students at the Harvard Business School.
That detail alone is wild to me. The major corporate music industry literally goes to the ivory tower of Harvard Business School to figure out how to corner the black music market.
The official title of the study was A Study of the Soul Music Environment, but the industry just called it the Harvard Report.
And Clive Davis was involved in this, right?
Yes, at the time, Clive Davis was the head of Columbia.
Yeah.
The major labels were looking at independent, Black-owned companies like Stax Records in Memphis and Motown in Detroit, and they saw massive exploding profit.
Black music was crossing over in a big way.
It was incredibly lucrative. And the major labels wanted that market share. They didn't want to just participate, they wanted to dominate it entirely.
So what exactly did the Harvard students recommend? Like, how do you take over a market that is fundamentally rooted in independent grassroots culture?
The mechanics of the strategy were honestly ruthless. The report essentially provided a blueprint for corporatization.
Okay.
The recommendation was, do not try to build a grassroots soul division from scratch. Instead, use your massive corporate capital to offer distribution deals to the independent labels and then systematically buy out and poach their established talent.
Oh, wow. So they basically starved the indies of their biggest stars.
Precisely. They lured away the top producers, writers, and artists with massive contracts that the independent labels simply couldn't match. And then they created their own in-house black music divisions at the major labels.
Now, on one hand, you could argue this brought black artists to a massive global crossover audience with huge marketing budgets.
You could, but the economic fallout on the community level was devastating.
How so?
It effectively decimated the independent, black-owned record label ecosystem. All the power, the distribution networks, and the vast majority of the profits were suddenly centralized into the hands of a few white-owned corporate conglomerates in New York and Los Angeles.
That is just brutal. And looking at the sources, the restructuring didn't stop with the record labels. This corporate takeover extended directly to the airwaves.
Yes, this is where the perspective of Bob Law comes in.
He's a pioneer of black radio and a media justice advocate, right?
Mhm.
His account in the sources is harrowing. He talks about the destruction of NATRA.
The National Association of Television and Radio Announcers, NATRA, is a crucial, often forgotten piece of this puzzle.
Tell us about them, because I didn't realize how powerful local DJs used to be.
They were incredibly powerful. It was an organization of black radio DJs and announcers. And to understand their power, you have to realize that in the 1960s, local black radio wasn't just playing music.
It was basically the social network of the time.
Exactly. It was the vital communication network for the community. It was how political thought, civil rights organizing, and local news were disseminated.
The sources mention that in August 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. actually gave a keynote speech to NATRA.
He did.
He explicitly praised them as being absolutely essential to the civil rights movement. He knew that to reach the people, he needed the DJs.
But Bob Law explains that this political power made NATRA incredibly dangerous to the white industry executives.
Because they couldn't control the message.
Right. So after King's assassination and as the 70s progressed, there was a concerted, mechanical effort to dismantle that power.
How does an organization praised by MLK just disappear, though? What were the actual mechanics of destroying it?
It happened through corporate consolidation, fueled by changing broadcast regulations that would eventually culminate in things like the 1996 Telecommunications Act.
Okay, so the big companies just bought everything up.
Exactly. Major conglomerates began buying up local independent radio stations. Once they owned the station, they fired the local DJs who had deep ties to the community and political autonomy.
And who did they replace them with?
They replaced them with syndicated, heavily formatted programming. They instituted strict playlists dictated by corporate headquarters.
So the local DJ who might, say, play a radical spoken word record or spend 10 minutes talking about a local rent strike on the air.
They're suddenly replaced by a mandate to just play the top 40 pop hits and read ad copy.
Wow.
As Law painstakingly details, they actively worked to remove, silence, and erase any institutional memory of black militant or radical thought from the airwaves. The radio landscape was entirely sanitized to sell a manufactured, formulaic product.
So you have the independent labels gutted and absorbed. You have the political and community voice of local radio silenced and corporatized.
It's a systematic dismantling.
But there's a third layer to this economic reality that the sources hit on, and this brings it down to the literal street level, the physical defunding of public school music programs in the inner cities.
Yes. While Columbia Records was spending fortunes at Harvard to study black consumers, the municipalities where those consumers lived, places like the Bronx in New York, were facing severe economic crises.
So the city budget's just cratered.
They did. Cities slashed their budgets, and the very first things to go were the arts and music programs in public schools.
The sources note this was a trend that continued for decades, actually.
Yeah.
Like, it was compounded later by federal policies like No Child Left Behind, which tied school funding to standardized math and reading scores, further marginalizing arts education.
The physical reality was stark. The youth in the Bronx in the late 1970s were losing access to traditional music education entirely.
There were no trumpets to rent.
No, there were no pianos in the classrooms, there were no band directors. The physical infrastructure of traditional music making was just removed from their environment.
It is an incredible, dark irony. I mean, the major labels are spending absolute fortunes studying black culture just to sell them manufactured pop music.
Right.
While simultaneously the grassroots structures that actually created the art, the schools, the local radio stations, the independent studios are being systematically defunded or destroyed.
It was a perfect storm of economic and cultural disenfranchisement.
I really want you, the listener, to pause and imagine this scenario. Imagine being a creative, energetic kid living in the South Bronx in 1978.
Okay, put yourself in their shoes.
You have music in your soul.
Yeah.
You want to express yourself. You want to tell the story of your neighborhood, but you literally cannot afford to buy a Fender Stratocaster guitar.
Out of the question.
Your public school has dismantled the band program, and when you turn on the radio, you just hear sanitized corporate pop that doesn't reflect your reality at all. You have no instruments, no money, and no platform. How do you make a song?
Well, when human beings are faced with conditions that provide no resources and no traditional tools, human ingenuity always finds a workaround.
It really does.
If they didn't have a grand piano or a brass section, the youth of the Bronx decided they just didn't need them. They turned to the only technology that was left behind in their homes, the turntable.
Right, the early days with DJs like Kool Herc.
Exactly. Kool Herc noticed that the crowds at his parties went the craziest during the short instrumental drum breaks of old James Brown or funk records.
So what do you do?
He used 2 turntables and 2 copies of the same record to endlessly loop that 5-second drum break. He physically isolated the rhythm, creating a continuous bed of music for people to dance to and for MCs to speak over.
But eventually, this physical turntable ingenuity found a digital counterpart. They found a revolutionary gray box that would change the trajectory of global music forever.
Yes.
And this perfectly transitions us to section 3 of your notes because we need to talk about the sampler. We need to talk about the EMU SP1200.
This is where the story shifts from sheer survival to absolute technological virtuosity. The SP1200 is arguably one of the most important instruments of the 20th century.
I was completely geeking out over the technical manuals in the sources.
They are fascinating.
The SP1200 was released in August 1987. It was designed by an engineer named Dave Rossum at EMU Systems. It functioned as both a drum machine and a sampler. And when you look at the physical specs of this machine today, it is almost comical.
It is absurd by modern standards.
Truly. I mean, I have terabytes of pristine, high-definition audio on my phone right now. But the SP1200, it had a 12-bit linear data format.
Right.
It had a ridiculously low sample rate of 26.04 kilohertz. And the absolute kicker, it had a grand total of only 10 seconds of sample memory for the entire machine. Total.
For the whole device.
Yeah, and you couldn't even use all 10 seconds at once. It had a maximum limit of 2.5 seconds per individual drum pad.
Let's actually break down what those limitations mean mechanically for a listener who maybe isn't an audio engineer.
Please do, because when I read 26.04 kilohertz, I just know it sounds small, but I don't really know the mechanics behind it.
Think of audio sample rate like the frame rate of a movie. If you watch a movie shot at 60 frames per second, motion is incredibly smooth and lifelike.
Okay, makes sense.
If you drop it to 10 frames per second, it becomes choppy, blurry, and degraded. A standard CD quality audio file has a sample rate of 44.1 kilohertz, meaning the computer takes a snapshot of the audio 44,100 times every single second to recreate the sound wave perfectly.
So the SP1200 only taking 26,040 snapshots a second means it's missing a huge amount of audio information. It's the choppy, blurry movie.
Exactly. It couldn't reproduce high frequencies well at all. And the 12-bit depth is like a limited color palette. Instead of millions of colors, you only have a few hundred to paint with.
So the audio resolution is inherently degraded from the start.
Yes. But the most punishing limitation was that 10 seconds of total memory.
Honestly, how on earth do you produce an entire 3-minute song with 10 seconds of audio?
Because of that tiny memory limit, hip-hop producers developed an absolute genius, deeply technical workaround.
I couldn't believe this when I read it.
It's brilliant. Let's say a producer in 1988 wanted to sample a heavy drum break and a horn riff from a 1974 funk record. If they recorded it normally, a 4-bar loop might take up 5 or 6 seconds.
That's over half their machine's memory gone instantly.
Right. They couldn't build a complex song that way.
I was trying to guess how they fixed this before I read the answer in the sources. Like, did they just use incredibly short staccato notes?
No, they didn't compromise the length of the musical phrase. They manipulated physics.
Okay, explain this.
They would take a standard 33 and a third RPM vinyl record, put it on their turntable, and switch the turntable speed to the much faster 45 RPM setting.
Oh, so the record spins way faster. The music sounds super high-pitched like the Chipmunks, and the tempo is incredibly fast.
Precisely. Let's do the math on that. If a drum loop takes 4 seconds to play at normal speed, playing it at a faster speed might compress that physical audio into just 2.5 seconds of real time.
And then they sample that.
Exactly. They would sample that fast, squeaky, compressed snippet into the SB1200. They just saved 1.5 seconds of RAM. In 1987, that was incredibly valuable real estate.
Okay, wait. I understand how that saves physical space in the memory,
Yeah.
but if they just leave it like that, the final song is going to sound like a frantic, high-pitched cartoon.
And this is where the virtuosity of the machine comes in. Once that compressed sample was safely stored inside the SP1200's RAM, the producer would use the machine's tuning function, its drop sample pitch shifting algorithm, to slow the audio back down to its normal speed and pitch inside the box.
Let me get this straight. If they speed it up on the turntable, record it, and then mathematically slow it back down inside the sampler, shouldn't it just sound exactly like the original normal record again?
You would think so.
Right.
But here is where the technical limitations created magic. Because the machine was only 12-bit and had that low 26 kilohertz sample rate, it just didn't have the processing power to smoothly stretch the audio. It lacked an advanced reconstruction filter. So when it slowed the audio down, the computer chip literally had to drop, guess, or duplicate digital sample data to stretch the sound wave out.
It's like pulling the fabric so hard it starts to tear.
That is a perfect analogy. This mathematical tearing introduced heavy aliasing, digital artifacts, and a distinct ringing distortion.
But it doesn't sound bad on the final tracks.
Because, and this is the masterstroke of Dave Rossum's engineering, the SP1200 didn't just output that harsh digital noise directly. It ran the audio output through analog SSM2044 filter chips.
So you have this harsh, torn, low-resolution digital grit being squeezed through a warm, smooth analog filter circuit.
Exactly. The combination of that 12-bit drop sample distortion and the analog filter created a signature, gritty, warm, punchy, and dirty sound.
The classic sound.
Yes. The kick drum sounded incredibly heavy. The snares cracked through the mix. That specific sonic texture defined the golden age of hip-hop. The limitation of the machine wasn't just a hurdle. The producers turned the machine's failure into an aesthetic goal.
It's the equivalent of a filmmaker deliberately choosing to shoot on a specific expired, grainy 16 millimeters film stock because the physical texture of the grain adds a gritty emotion to the scene that a perfect 4K digital camera just can't capture.
Exactly. And this completely reframes how we must look at the people using these machines.
Which brings us to Lupe Fiasco.
Yes, the sources include an incredibly passionate, deeply analytical defense of the sampler from rapper Lupe Fiasco. And it's worth noting he isn't just an artist. He is an academic teaching rap as a visiting professor at places like MIT.
And his argument is vital. He argues that people who dismiss sampling as just pushing buttons or who write it off as stealing someone else's music completely misunderstand the extreme virtuosity required to manipulate these machines.
Fiasco argues that the SP1200 and later machines like the Akai MPC series became literal physical instruments.
Just like the piano we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly. The students of music production who play these machines have to develop the same deep, nuanced understanding of timing, feeling, mechanical interaction, and sonic texture as John Coltrane had when he picked up a saxophone.
Think about the haiku. Writing a haiku is severely restricted. You only get 5, 7, and 5 syllables. But no one says a haiku isn't real poetry because it's short.
Right, the limitation is the point.
The limitation doesn't stifle the creativity. The strict boundary forces the genius to emerge. The 10-second limit of the SP1200 is the musical haiku. I want you to think about the absolute precision required here.
It's immense.
You have to listen to a 1970s funk record. You have to locate a half-second snare drum hidden beneath a bass line. You have to physically cue the turntable, sample it at the exact millisecond, truncate the digital waveform perfectly so there are no clicks or pops, map it to a gray rubber pad, and then physically tap that pad flawlessly to a brand new tempo without it sounding like a chaotic wall of noise.
You are playing the machine.
It requires an insane amount of physical rhythm and mathematical foresight. How can anyone call that just pushing a button?
They can't, not if they understand it. And the sources unpack a really fascinating theoretical concept to describe this intricate process, the hip-hop time machine.
I absolutely love this part of the notes. Can you break down the actual equation they present for this time machine?
The sources present the equation as follows. Hip-hop equals, in parentheses, improvised performance plus digital sampling technology multiplied by, in the second parentheses, pre-recorded musicians plus time.
It literally reads like a mathematical formula for temporal physics.
Because in a cultural sense, it really is. Think about the mechanics of what is happening. When a 19-year-old producer in 1992 is sitting alone in their bedroom at 2 a.m., meticulously chopping up a James Brown drum break from 1969, or slicing a Bob James jazz piano chord from 1974.
They aren't just passively stealing audio.
No, they are engaging in a solitary, non-real-time jam session with musicians from decades past.
So the producer's playing the drum machine, but James Brown's drummer, Clyde Stubblefield, is reacting on the sample.
Exactly. The producer is interacting with the recorded utterances of the past. They are reacting to the swing of a 1970s bass player, cutting it off, re-triggering it, collaborating with ghosts across the decades.
So if we bring this all the way back to Philip Ewell and the white male frame,
Let's do it.
when a traditional music theorist dismisses hip-hop because it doesn't feature an orchestra of musicians playing live in a room together, they are missing the entire point.
The orchestra's there.
Exactly. It's just a temporal orchestra scattered across 50 years of recorded history. The producer isn't a fake musician. The producer is the conductor of time.
That is a phenomenal way to articulate it. And this concept of jamming with the past wasn't just a neat audio trick born of technological necessity. It was a profound restorative cultural act.
It reconnected them.
Yes. The sampler allowed hip-hop to do something vital. It relinked a generation of disenfranchised Black youth to a musical heritage that the corporate music industry, the legacy of the Harvard Report and the defunding of radio, had actively tried to pave over, sanitize, and erase.
Which brings us perfectly into Section 4 of your outline, the continuum of Black American music. Because the narrative we often hear is that hip-hop was a complete break from the past, like a loud, disruptive aberration.
But Lupe Fiasco is adamant in his interview that this narrative is entirely false. He asserts that hip-hop is not an isolated island. It is a direct, unbroken continuation of Black American musical traditions.
He gives a brilliant comparative example in the sources, right?
Okay.
He compares the repetitive looped structure of a rap beat to the traditional structure of blues.
Yes, he specifically mentions the legendary blues song Smokestack Lightning by Howlin' Wolf.
What's the connection there?
Well, if you listen to Smokestack Lightning, the underlying musical bed is essentially a simple repeating 2-bar guitar vamp. It just loops that exact same riff over and over and over again for the entire duration of the song.
So there's no chorus, no bridge, no complex modulation into a different key.
Exactly. A traditional classical theorist looking at that through the white male frame might say, well, it's harmonically stagnant. It just repeats. Isn't it boring?
But Fiasco points out that both the blues and rap prioritize entirely different elements than classical music.
Right. They prioritize the lyrical message, the storytelling, the vocal delivery, and the microrhythmic pocket. The simplicity of the musical bed is entirely intentional and historically rooted.
It's a canvas, not the painting.
That's a great analogy. In the blues, the repeating guitar vamp creates a hypnotic, trance-like space for the vocalist to express deep, agonizing emotion and narrative.
And in hip-hop.
In hip-hop, the repeating, sampled 2-bar loop creates a steady, predictable rhythmic pocket for the MC to deliver incredibly intricate wordplay, internal rhyme schemes, and rhythmically complex poetry.
Because if the beat beneath the rapper was constantly shifting through complex jazz chord progressions and changing time signatures,
It would completely distract from the primary focus of the art form, the lyric and the rhythm.
But it's crucial to note that even within that rigid looping structure, producers found incredibly subtle ways to assert their humanity against the cold mathematics of the digital machine.
They absolutely did.
The sources highlight this by looking at the legendary producer Jay Dilla.
Jay Dilla is absolutely central to understanding the evolution of the sampler as a virtuoso instrument. By the time Dilla was producing heavily in the mid to late 90s, samplers had evolved. He primarily used the Akai MPC 3000.
Okay.
And this machine had a standard feature built into its software called quantize.
Right. For those listening who don't produce music, quantization is essentially an autocorrect for rhythm. If I am tapping out a drum beat on the pads with my fingers, my human timing will be slightly flawed.
Mm.
I might hit the snare a millisecond early. The quantize feature takes my sloppy human hits and mathematically snaps them perfectly onto a rigid grid. It makes the beat flawless, rigid, and strictly machine-like.
But Dilla did something revolutionary. He deliberately turned the quantize feature off.
He just rejected the perfect math entirely.
He wanted the imperfection. He played his drum hits live on the pads, slightly off beat, and just left them that way. He might program the kick drum to land perfectly on the downbeat, but he would intentionally play the snare drum a fraction of a second late.
Or he would rush the hi-hats so they played slightly ahead of the beat.
Yes. The sources mention a term from ethnomusicology for this, participatory discrepancy.
It sounds like academic jargon, honestly. What does it actually mean?
It just means the microscopic human errors, the push and pull of timing between musicians, that make live music feel alive, breathing, and grooving. Dilla was programming those human discrepancies into a digital computer.
By turning off the quantize and playing off the grid, he created beats that felt dragging, drunken, and deeply, undeniably human.
And here is where my mind completely melted reading your notes. Dilla's unquantized, drunken programming was so profoundly musical, so undeniably virtuosic, that the cycle of inspiration actually reversed itself.
It is an incredible feedback loop.
The sources mention modern jazz artists like the pianist Robert Glasper and drummer Chris Dave. Today, you have world-class, conservatory-trained, live jazz drummers who are sitting behind physical acoustic drum kits, actively trying to emulate the unquantized, dragging, slightly offbeat sound of a J. Dilla beat.
That is wild. You have human trying to play like a sampler that was being played by a human trying to sound unmachine-like.
It is a stunning testament to Dilla's genius, and it proves that the sampler birthed an entirely new rhythmic vocabulary that the traditional jazz world is now adopting. It speaks to the deep reciprocal reverence hip-hop has for its predecessors.
Which was incredibly explicit during the Native Tongues movement in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah. Yes, groups like A Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul, Degable Planets.
These artists deliberately pivoted away from sampling heavy funk and James Brown and actively began sampling underground bebop and cool jazz records.
And importantly, they weren't just digging for a random cool sound to rap over.
No, the sources say they were intentionally sampling very specific jazz codes. Like they would isolate a walking acoustic bass line from a Ron Carter record, or a muted trumpet from Miles Davis, or a specific jazz snare brush technique.
By actively incorporating those highly recognizable sonic codes, they were making it a profound cultural statement. They were actively claiming the cultural prestige and intellectual weight of jazz.
They were drawing a direct, undeniable sonic lineage between the underground, fiercely competitive jam session battles of the bebop era in the 1940s and the street corner cipher battles of MCs in the 1990s.
Exactly. They were telling the world, we are not a disconnected aberration. We are the direct descendants of Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk. This is the exact same energy. We are just using a different instrument.
And today, you see that reverence institutionalized in the aesthetic itself.
Oh, everywhere.
You have groups like The Roots. They are a fully live, acoustic band drums, bass, keyboards. But they will often strive to play live in a way that perfectly recreates the exact sonic artifacts of old, choppy samples.
Right. Or you have modern producers like the JUSTICE League who will hire live orchestras, record them, and then meticulously process the audio to make it sound like a dusty 12-bit SP1200 sample from a vinyl record.
It proves that the sampled sound, that gritty, low-resolution 12-bit texture born of 10 seconds of memory, isn't just a byproduct of outdated technology anymore.
No, it is a highly sought-after aesthetic goal in itself. It is a sonic monument to the history of the genre.
Which brings us full circle all the way back to Section 1 and Philip Ewell's critique of the Academy.
Let's tie it all together.
If Ewell's white male frame constantly demands European nuance, harmonic modulation, and physical causality to validate classical music, isn't it just endlessly poetically fascinating that hip-hop artists achieved the ultimate profound complexity by using a restricted 12-bit gray box to weave together 50 years of Black history, economic struggle, and cultural defiance into a single looping 3-minute track?
It is entirely fascinating, and it completely exposes the flaw in forcing the traditional academic framework onto modern art. Ewell actually cites a concept from sociologist Kieran Healy in his paper.
Yeah, the one with the provocative title.
Healy wrote an article provocatively titled, Fuck Nuance.
That is quite the academic title. What does Healy mean by that?
Healy argues that in academia, constantly demanding more nuance and microscopic complexity is often just a rhetorical trick used to obscure a stark, undeniable truth.
Interesting.
Sometimes the truth is direct. The truth of hip-hop's genius is stark, direct, and rhythmic. Over-intellectualizing it with European frameworks of functional tonality just obscures its absolute brilliance.
Hip-hop doesn't need to be validated by an 18th century standard of what makes music real.
Exactly. It established its own entirely new standard of virtuosity.
So as we wrap up this massive journey, let's look at the ground we've covered today.
We covered a lot.
We started by examining how the traditional academy's white racial frame unfairly dismisses hip-hop. We looked at how demanding 18th century European standards of melody and physical causality creates an epistemology of ignorance that literally defines rap out of existence.
Right.
We explored the devastating economic strip mining of the 1970s, how the Harvard Report corporatized the independent labels, how the telecommunications industry silenced local black radio, and how municipal defunding left a generation of youth without access to traditional instruments.
And out of that structural void, we marveled at the sheer defiant technological virtuosity of those youth.
The SP1200.
We saw how they took the severe, almost comical limitations of machines like the SP1200 manipulating physics with 45 RPM records to squeeze audio into 10 seconds of memory and built a literal hip-hop time machine.
They chopped, pitched, and jammed with the ghosts of the past to carry the continuum of the blues and jazz forward into the digital age.
Deliberately turning off the quantized to assert their humanity over the machine's grid.
It is a profound story of triumph, of turning severe limitation into endless innovation, and of undeniable musical legitimacy. But before we go, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own.
Yes, today we have the luxury of hindsight. We can look back at the critics from 1918 who called jazz barbaric, or we can look at the terrified rioters who blew a crater in Comacy Park, destroying disco records in 1979, and we easily, comfortably recognize their ignorance.
We clearly see the white male frame and cultural panic in action.
But human psychology, specifically the concept of repetition compulsion, warns us that older generations inevitably, almost biologically, attack the new forms of expression. It is a cycle that constantly repeats itself.
So ask yourself right now, what emerging hyper-digital, chaotic, or sample-heavy genre, maybe something being made by kids right now on their iPhones, or heavily utilizing AI generation, or chopped up on TikTok, what genre are you currently dismissing as just pushing buttons, or not real music?
Are you doing the exact same thing the critics of jazz and hip hop did? Are you judging the future of art through an outdated frame?
It is a crucial mirror to hold up to our own biases. Are we actually listening to the intention, the emotion, and the cultural context of the artist? Or are we just angrily demanding that they conform to the physical tools of the past?
Because remember what we started with, the expectation of physical causality, the carpenter striking the wooden piano key.
It is comforting. We like what we know. But the maestro of tomorrow might not have calluses on their fingers. They might just be tapping a piece of flat glass on a touch screen, orchestrating 100 years of recorded history,
Ugh.
bending time and physics in a fraction of a second.
And if you are too busy looking for a grand piano,
You might just miss the genius happening right in front of you.